As we move forward in the 21st century, what is the most important question that Americans of goodwill should be asking themselves?
Well, I think the most important question is which direction are we trending in? And let me explain what I mean. If we were to say, for example, and this is just a random number, that the stock market closed at 2,500 shares yesterday, or 25,000 shares. Well, that's one data point, but what we really need to know is what was the closing point the day before, the week before. So then, if we get that additional data point and we know that in the previous day or the previous week, the market closed at 40,000 shares, then that tells us something very important. We're
Right.
trending in the wrong direction. So, in terms of this whole conversation about race, the question is, which way are we trending?
Right. Can you speak more about the importance of knowing which way we're trending?
Yeah. So obviously, just the example that I just gave, because if we're trending in the right direction, then obviously we want to maintain that, right? And we want to build on that. We want to reinforce the positives. If we're trending, however, in the wrong direction, which I think we are in this country in the year 2024 and certainly in the year 2023, and arguably since the George Floyd massacre, or rather that not massacre but murder, and all of the mayhem and all of the upheaval that happened as a result of that, we have been trending in the wrong direction. We've been suppressing the conversation in this country about race to the point of even criminalizing it, right?
Right.
To the point of saying that we can't talk about race in public schools, particularly here in Florida. Everything is wrongfully lumped under the heading of critical race theory, when in fact that's something that's taught at law school, right? So, but we don't want to talk about race. W. Du Bois wrote a book or a piece back in the late 1800s called The Souls of Black Folk. And what he projected back then was the most important line going forward into the 20th century would be the color line. But what he said is that Americans have a habit of just growing tired of discussing the issue of race. And so we just shove it, and we artificially and inaccurately declare ourselves to have been cured from the problem of race, when in fact race continues to be a problem in this country, and we're trending in the wrong direction.
Can you explain what you mean when you say that the struggle is cyclical?
Yeah, so one of our challenges is understanding why we keep revisiting the same issues. When I say cyclical, when most people hear the term civil rights, we're thinking in terms of the 1960s, but the first series of civil rights laws that were passed in this country happened right after slavery came to an end. So there was a Civil Rights Act of 1866, and there was a Civil Rights Act of 1875. But what most people don't realize is that in 1883, the United States Supreme Court substantially eroded or knocked down or essentially took away the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And thereafter, we went backwards. So we see ourselves going in circles. We make progress and then we lose progress. And it's pretty predictable. There's a pretty predictable cycle. And right now, we're trending in the wrong direction.
So, how do we straighten out the circle or cycle of justice or injustice?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I find myself pondering that often. But again, I think it goes back to first of all, identifying that is what's going on, that there is a cycle. And I've lectured on this before, and I say that there's 4 stages to that cycle. If we're looking at and thinking in terms of a clock, the face of a clock, at high noon, that's when oppression is most effective. Let's think in terms of slavery. Then from 12 to 12:15, we're engaging the oppressor, the dominant group, in a conversation to get them to acknowledge that there is a wrong that needs to be righted. So what happens is once we get to 12:15, then we've accomplished what is called confession.
Okay.
So we go from oppression to confession. And that's where there's an acknowledgement that we need to change. Then once we all are in agreement, that is those in power and those who are being previously have been oppressed or enslaved, once we all are in agreement that change needs to occur, then what happens from 12:15 to 12:30, again using this metaphor of the clock, is progression or progress. We're making progress. We're passing laws. We're making declarations. We're instituting executive orders. The president is mandating that all departments under his or her control are going to resist and going to reject all forms of racial and gender and other forms of oppression. So we're making progress. But then where we begin to lose it is that we don't realize that there's always going to be this resistant, this intractable group of citizens who feels that America is for a set group to benefit from and everyone else to serve their narrow interests and their narrow goals. Some would say that it's an oligarchy. Some would say that it's simply an economic system of oppression that favors people of a certain skin color, of a certain heritage, particularly of Western European heritage. However you want to categorize it, there are people who hold that view. They've held that view since the end of slavery, and they continue to hold that view. And the thing is, while we're out celebrating the progress, they're planning to recapture lost ground. So because we are not always watchful and mindful, we slip from progression to regression. And so if we're staying with our clock for a moment, from 12:30 to 11:45, we are regressing. And there's thoughts such as what is called reverse discrimination. There's a tax on affirmative action because those policies that were put in place to lift up the oppressed are now seen as unfair privilege and unfair benefit, when in fact they're simply restoring, repairing the harm that was previously done. But those policies and those laws are successfully mischaracterized and demonized when we're in that period of aggression, right? And then when we get to a quarter till, from a quarter till back to 12, we're in a cycle trending toward oppression. And so we see this cycle happening again and again and again. And right now, arguably, the hand on the clock is somewhere around 12:40 in my thinking. So we have to understand that this cycle exists first and foremost before we can then identify a means of straightening it out. And one of the things that we have to consider is that all people are not for progress. There are some people who will never be convinced that it's important that all people have equal opportunity. There are some people in all racial groups that have always been convinced of that and have always worked toward that. So those, then, the people of goodwill, whoever they are, whatever communities they are part of, have to resolve within themselves that they're going to have to work together continually to reestablish progress and to guard against regression.